All right, and we're live on Energy Superheroes. Today we have Andrew Isle, and he's the head of climate risk for TCS North America. Also advises startups on climate risk and venture capital. Andrew writes for two publications, The Observer and Aluminum. He recently wrote for Aluminum about the World Economic Forum's annual survey. Andrew thinks very deeply about the future and the impacts of the climate crisis on our shared future. So we're really excited to talk about that today and learn really what does the future hold for us in the context of the climate crisis. Andrew, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Peter. Happy to be here.
Yeah, so as we were talking in the beginning, you definitely strike me as a futurist and somebody who thinks deeply about the future. So share with the audience, if you could, in your mind, what does the future hold given where we are in relation to the climate crisis?
Well, the WMO, the World Meteorological Organization, has given us a pretty good picture of what's likely to be coming in the next 5 years. And I think it's important to emphasize for your audience that even those of us who are pretty attuned to climate change often tend to assume that a lot of the severe impacts are still decades away. And while that's, of course, true, and the impacts will accumulate over time, many of the disruptive impacts of climate change on our natural world, on our society, on our infrastructure are already here or arriving very soon. And all it takes is looking out the window or opening the front door for many of us. And that has really accelerated in the past couple of years, particularly this year. I would say that as many parts of the Northern Hemisphere are enveloped in severe heat waves and droughts. We've been seeing flooding in places where we're not used to it, like Vermont just in the past week. You really can't open the newspaper without being bombarded with images of climate fueled extreme weather. And that really is a window into what we can expect a lot more of in the years to come. We have been, as of 2022, in a world of a little less than 1.2 degrees centigrade warming, which is already over 2 degrees Fahrenheit over historical averages. And we haven't even broached some of the thresholds that we're approaching related to 1.5 degrees, which was the stretch target for the Paris Agreement. And what people may not realize is we could be broaching it this year. And so with the advent of an El Nino weather cycle, we can expect a lot of extremes. And so what that means is this world of disruption, this world of extremes, of different kinds of phenomena, both directly in the natural world and in our society, our economy, our politics, as those impacts and our response to climate change ripples through our fabric of the society. It's going to look different from what it's looked like in the past. And regardless of what we do in terms of bending the emissions curve and transforming the economy, a lot of these impacts are baked in. They're already here and they're only getting worse, which means that we need to walk and chew gum at the same time in terms of reducing emissions and in terms of managing the impacts of these changes that are already baked in. And that's going to be hard. It's going to be very bewildering, and society is going to continue to change very quickly. And so that's what I spend my days thinking about is what is this going to look like and how do we manage it? And so happy to dig into that deeper if you like.
And no, those are big topics. And I'm sure you talk a lot to companies. As you advise companies, where do they see first risk mitigation, but also where are the opportunities if you're able to move quickly in this environment?
Sure. Thanks for that question. So a lot of what has been happening on the risk management side in recent years has been driven by something called the TCFD, which is short for the Task Force on Climate Related Financial Disclosures, which is a bit of a mouthful. TCFD is a lot easier. It was spearheaded by Michael Bloomberg and Mark Carney the former mayor of New York and former head of the Bank of England, among other accolades of both of theirs, both very active leaders in the climate space. And they helped to initiate back in 2015 what was then an industry driven process for creating a voluntary framework to identify climate risks and opportunities and help companies to disclose them to investors. And the purpose was to really improve the state of publicly available information around climate impacts such that investors could make informed decisions. And unless you have a common language and a common framework for talking about these issues, it's very hard to communicate meaningfully about what it is you're talking about. And so, even though regulators were not involved at that point, it was purely voluntary, it was seen as something that was really critical to help the market function, to have free flowing information with a common set of principles and concepts and approaches that would help both corporates and investors to understand this climate risk topic better and its impacts on financial assets and financial markets. And that effort culminated in the publication of something called the TCFD recommendations in 2017. And it has been a runaway success. It now has over 4,000 organizations that have subscribed to this framework, responsible for tens of trillions of assets under management or revenues in terms of reporting companies. And not only that framework has now become the foundation for what has been adopted by the International Sustainability Standards Board for its sustainability and climate reporting. It's been adopted by CDP, which is another framework for voluntary corporate reporting on climate change. And perhaps most meaningfully, it's been adopted now as the basic framework by many regulators who are now imposing climate risk disclosure, or in some cases, climate risk management on corporates and on financial institutions. And so this whole push towards standardization and in many cases regulation is driving a number of actions to tackle climate risk. And so that is how many entities out in the marketplace are encountering climate risk for the first time. But it's important to remember that there are a lot of opportunities here as well. And so sometimes those are also included in the disclosure. A lot of it is about capital preservation, it's about risk management. But at the same time, the flip side of every challenge is an opportunity, because where there are new problems, people will come with new solutions to those problems. And it's creating a lot of new marketplaces that the smart money is going to have a terrific leg up on. And so that's a really exciting development, as well as we enter a lot of these new realities that will reshape the markets where a lot of companies and investors operate.
No doubt. And I echo that. We see a lot with regards to carbon credits. So if companies are able to come up with a way of reducing GHGs, they're able to generate a carbon credit. Now, traditionally, those were done with sort of nature based credits and what I would call almost like forestry management, which has a place but has come under criticism lately. What we're starting to see is a lot of companies developing new, let's say, ways of making materials or ways of reducing emissions for essential items that are needed. And when they do that, they're going to generate a tech enabled sort of credit, ideally here in North America or in the market where the emissions come from in the first place. And that's those credits we're now seeing increase in value. JP Morgan recently bought a big tranche of those credits at a record price. Beyond credits, or I guess my first question would be is what do you think about the voluntary carbon credits market to begin with? But then beyond that, are there other sorts of financial mechanisms that can reward companies that are first movers in this space?
Yeah, it's a good question. And, I think it's tough right now to determine where we are exactly with carbon credits, because I think that there is a well-established trend now that investors and consumers care about climate change, and policymakers care about climate change as well, by the way. So they're also compliance markets, right? Where you have carbon trading through cap and trade or cap and dividend policies that are mandatory for entities in those jurisdictions. But on the voluntary side, I think the market is evolving very quickly because you have carbon removals that have come about. You have carbon insetting, where companies are investing in decarbonizing their own supply chains and operations in ways that sometimes can generate credits, certainly can create accountability. It can enable accounting for the additionality of different activities that corporates are undertaking to meet their climate goals. And you have these new categories, right? There's removals, but also different kinds of avoided emissions credits as well, some of them nature based, some of them not. So there's been a lot of work afoot in the industry of carbon markets to ensure their integrity and to create rules of the road to prevent greenwashing, to prevent the abuse of those markets. And I think, as the corporate space grapples with the challenges around net zero, with commitments around decarbonization that in many cases are proving more difficult than was originally envisioned when they started signing on to these commitments. And the fact that not every carbon credit is created equal. And a lot of them, in fact, have been shown to be deficient in their integrity. I think there are a lot of sort of mixed signals and mixed trends. And so it is a little bit of a buyer beware environment right now. I think the broader trend towards the growth of these markets is likely to persist, but it may be a little bit of a bumpy ride because there are different ways that one can go about trying to push down emissions. And in the voluntary space, there's a lot that's dependent ultimately on sentiment, and that sentiment rests on the perception of integrity of the market. Rests on corporate commitments. It rests on investor demand from the corporate sector. So those are things that can potentially change quickly. So I think there's a lot of opportunity, but it's also a space where it's a little difficult to predict the twists and the turns of the marketplace.
No, I think that's right. It's certainly not straightforward. So, speaking of not straightforward, I think a lot of times the reason big companies come to a consulting group like a TCS or a McKinsey is because these problems are not straightforward. And they're looking for somebody who's a deep thought leader to help them navigate when there's a lot of uncertainty. What are some of the questions that you're getting around this whole area of climate science or the climate crisis? What's an area that maybe large companies don't fully yet understand? And where's the confusion that you're still seeing out there?
Yeah, so big question. And there are a lot of uncertainties and challenges out there. And I think it doesn't matter how much of an expert, anyone is or claims to be. These are really hard questions. And we're grappling with one of the biggest meta phenomena that is really changing how our society operates and the physical environment in which we live in ways that are completely unprecedented. And we live in a very complex society that interacts with the natural world in ways that are difficult to fully understand or even model. And that makes these questions hard. It doesn't matter how experienced you are. Anyone who claims to have all the answers, viewed very skeptically. And so I think one needs to be humble in approaching these challenges. And so I think asking questions, even very basic questions, is very important. But to your point about what are our companies asking in the marketplace, I think there are a lot of questions around beginning to tackle climate risk and understanding one's exposure. And one of the biggest challenges to conforming with the recommendations, to complying with the disclosure recommendations of the TCFD, that climate risk disclosure framework I mentioned, is in the realm of scenario analysis, which is a required component of the strategy pillar. There are four pillars of the TCFD: governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. And we can talk about those if you're interested. But in the strategy pillar, there's this question of scenario analysis and whether one strategy is resilient to different possible futures that climate may influence. And that's really hard because it requires trying to identify the time frame, the impacts, the drivers of those impacts, what the ripple effects of those impacts will be, how that translates into financial risk and operational risk. And we're talking about things that are unprecedented, futures that look different from the present, and trying to tease apart what might those futures look like, which of them are plausible, and which of those are material for the business in question, right? Or for the entity conducting the scenario analysis. Those are really tough questions. And so that is a big part of it because it really does get at fundamental questions about what do I need to do to survive and thrive in this era of climate change in the future. And in many cases, it's not doing business according to business as usual. It requires some really pretty fundamental adjustments or even fundamental rethinks about what markets one plays in. And those are really important questions, but they're hard questions. And so there are some tools out there for thinking about emissions pathways out far into the future, out to 2050 and beyond. But I think many of the most pressing challenges for folks in the C-suite is what's going to happen just the next few years. And that's a cycle that's going to affect my near-term business planning. And even on that time frame, as we can see from extreme weather, from changes in policy, from market sentiment and political events, climate impacts those. And those are really material on almost anyone's time frame. And trying to understand what that near-term future might hold is an important part of managing climate risk.
I know for sure. One area I think about very simply is a company a buyer of energy or a seller of energy? And in this marketplace, I think as we move to new technologies that are zero emissions technologies, inevitably they won't be as developed as our current fossil based energy. And so my expectation is that energy prices in the short run are going to go up. And as a result, a big question we always have is, are you a buyer or seller of energy? If you're a seller of energy, you may have some upside surprises, which we've already seen with both traditional energy companies and new energy companies. But if you're a buyer of energy, you may be facing rising input costs. And we've started to see inflation, at least for the first time in my adult life, in a meaningful way. Is this an area of interest among your clients? Is this something they look at? Because we're certainly seeing that.
Absolutely. Energy is a critical input. And by the way, there are a lot of critical inputs across supply chain that are influenced and impacted by climate factors, right? And so energy is perhaps the biggest of the bunch, but there are a lot of really vital inputs and that are potentially subject to supply shocks, to price spikes resulting from disruptions of various kinds in the marketplace or in supply chains. And so anticipating that, having, you know, financially robust hedging strategies, having business continuity strategies, all those kinds of things are really important. And for energy producers, it's a big opportunity. Even if you're an energy consumer, preparing for disruptions or spikes or other approaches that can manage exposure to volatility in energy markets is really important. And I think that has really been put into evidence by a couple of the major macro disruptions we've seen in recent years, namely the COVID-19 pandemic and the Russian invasion of Ukraine, just in the last few years that, threw a huge wrench into energy markets, into supply chains and so forth. And those are actually quite vivid illustrations of what a lot of the climate fuel disruptions are already looking will continue to look like. I mean, many of us will remember the events of February 2021 when Texas had that unprecedented polar vortex, which took a lot of its energy resources offline, led to devastating price spikes and disruptions. Lives were lost and a lot of economic damage as prices went through the ceiling. And that is an example of an extreme weather event, likely fueled in part by climate change, that can be very disruptive. And those are the kinds of near-term scenarios that we need to be anticipating throughout the economy and through our governance structures as well.
No, it's extremely interesting you bring that up because that's an area of that I've paid a lot of attention to. And we saw companies start to think about what they call microgrids in order to support their resiliency. So if the grid isn't there for them, they want to be able to make sure they can still operate. And I actually see that as part and parcel of an overall localization. So you see this move of the buzzword is deglobalization now, right? Where the supply chain shocks during COVID and during Russia, Ukraine made people realize, wow, we better have more resiliency in our supply chain. Maybe we should localize it more. And you're seeing the same thing with this move towards microgrids, even saying maybe we can't trust the full large scale grid. We need to take care of ourselves at a local level as well. I don't know what the result is going to be other than if people come off the grid, let's say if big consumers of power end up coming off the grid, which is not contemplated, let me just say, under the microgrid scenarios, but if they use the grid less, that also will probably drive prices up for everybody else. So it's just an interesting phenomenon going on where I think drive towards localization can, in the short run, drive prices up. Hopefully, in the long run, it makes it more resilient and brings prices back down.
Yeah, I think these power market dynamics are really interesting because there are these, different pressures that sometimes militate in different directions. And sometimes, you know, they'll invest in that microgrid capability or, behind the meter management. My hunch is that, it's very difficult for most consumers of power really to be entirely self-reliant. And it requires so much investment to manage the peaks and valleys and to provide stability and of power and of pricing that it probably isn't going to lead people to completely disconnect and cut the cord. But at the same time, I do think that there is going to be a lot of evolution in the consumption patterns. And increasingly, more players are going to be both consumers and sellers of power, right? And anyone who has a solar panel, on their home or their facility and is in a market that allows net metering is already playing in that game, right? And where you have also demand response programs, you've got energy efficiency, different approaches that can help to better manage supply and demand. You have a much more complicated grid. And on the whole, that adds resiliency and is really critical to managing the energy transition. But when you have inelastic supply and inelastic demand, there's always a lot of potential for mismatch or for crises in times of extreme weather. And so these are tough challenges, and it's going to be interesting to see how we manage them going forward.
And no, thanks, Andrew. Very insightful. We've been talking, I'm a geek for economics, right? So we've been talking this high level stuff, but I know you also advise companies in the venture arena. Can you talk about unique or innovative technologies that you're seeing maybe among smaller companies or venture backed startups that you think are relevant to help mitigate climate crisis or play a role within the energy markets?
Yeah, so there are, broadly speaking, two kinds of climate solutions, right? To just break it down to fundamentals. One is the climate mitigation side, which is about reducing emissions, right? Anything that helps to make existing systems more efficient or substitutes out a polluting business model with a more environmentally friendly business model, right? That's mitigation. That's where most of the climate tech solutions are and where a lot of the investment to date has gone. What we're increasingly realizing is that there is an urgent need for climate resilience, and climate adaptation, which is fundamentally girding ourselves to be more resilient and adaptable in the face of these climate impacts that are inevitable. And so, for example, managing extreme heat, right? Managing disruptions to our supply chains, managing storms and sea level rise and impacts on agriculture, impacts on the built environment that we never previously anticipated. I lived in New York City, and at the beginning of June, we had the unprecedented air quality disaster that was a result of these Canadian wildfires, which are themselves largely fueled by climate change because of unprecedented heat and dryness up in the boreal forests of northern Quebec and other Canadian provinces, and all the smoke from those fires, which by the way are still burning, but due to the wind patterns came down into the US, and no one saw that coming, right? That's a form of climate impact as well. And, one kind of climate adaptation response to that is having better air purification and filtration, right? Not many people might have made the link between climate change and an air filter, but it is a climate solution on the resilient side. And so those are the types of solutions that we need to be advancing and connecting those dots, ideally before the crises strike, to really make ourselves more ready and more resilient to avoid the worst impacts from these climate fueled events. And they can be both chronic, where you have a very long term, long onset event, or they can be acute, where you have some near term weather crisis. And both of those are critical to address in our response on the climate resilience and adaptation side.
No, I think that's insightful. I did want to ask you about your piece where you analyzed the World Economic Forum survey. Could you talk a
Yeah.
little bit about that and sort of what was the survey? What do you think are the important conclusions that can be drawn from it? And then lastly, maybe tell us, why is the World Economic Forum controversial? We're seeing all this controversy. I'm just curious your thoughts there.
hmm Well, first, a little bit about that survey. So every year, the World Economic Forum surveys corporate executives, business leaders, political leaders, and they canvass more than 10,000 people. I don't remember exactly the number. I think it's over 12,000, and provides them with a survey that asks them what kinds of threats are they most preoccupied with, and what do they see as the most urgent and material risks for business and society. And so it is not focused on climate or environment per se, but in recent years, those issues have really climbed the priority list amongst these leading thinkers and decision makers. And this year, or rather the 2022 survey that was published in January, the results of which were published in January, indicated that climate and environmental risks of various types, whether it's extreme weather, whether it's failure to adapt, failure to bend emissions curves, ecosystem collapse, issues with biodiversity collapse, droughts, you name it. Those were packaged in certain ways and featured in these lists, both on the 2-year time frame and the 10-year time frame, which is what the WEF asked them. Really in ways that were much more high profile than previously, particularly on the 10-year time frame. 4 out of the top 5 risks were environmental and climate risks. That's a really good graphic where the types of risks are color coded and the environment and climate ones are in green, and there's just green splashed all over this graphic because that is what these business leaders are focused on. And I would argue that they're rightly focused on that, which is not to say that there aren't other critical and pressing issues out there. There are a lot of them. And in fact, one of the terms that they speak about in the report is this concept of polycrisis, right? Which has been used by multiple people. It was popularized by the economist Adam Tooze to really describe the era that we're living in, where you have these multiple different crises that are these sort of slow onset disasters, and they interact with each other. And in many ways, they exacerbate each other. And so climate change is often described as a threat multiplier in the national security community. And I think that's a good way to think about it, right? The climate is not divorced from other issues that you might be concerned about, like geopolitics or, economic crises and things like that. In fact, they are quite closely interlinked with climate and entwined with climate, and they interact with each other. That vulnerabilities we as a society have make us weaker and more fragile and more vulnerable in the face of climate shocks. And climate also can make those other crises worse as well. And so those are the kinds of things that we really need to be laser focused on if we're going to manage as a society, because these challenges are big, they're difficult, they're intractable, and we're late to the party, right? Or late to the battlefield, you might say more accurately. We have to reinvent a lot of how our economy operates. We need to place much of our infrastructure and our operating models across many different sectors. These are things that can't be done in a day. And so we have to be really focused on it and think creatively and really prioritize if we're going to be there and meet the challenge.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. So, World Economic Forum, it's in the media a lot. Why do you think it's controversial these days? I was listening to Rogan the other day and he's talking about Klaus Schwab and all this stuff. I just feel like I've followed WEF for a long time because I'm an economics geek, but all of a sudden it seems to have penetrated the mainstream. And I don't know, it's just interesting.
Well, tell me more about that. What was Rogan saying is controversial about them? Maybe I'm, you know, not listening to enough people, but tell me a little more about what you think is arousing people's ire.
Yeah. So what I've heard through the media is that the WEF has an agenda that's really more around, let's say, less free market, less democracy, more centralized control, and that they're a non-elected body that's influencing the world in a significant way that may not be advantageous.
I see. Well, look, I can't really speak for the WEF, right? And I also am not really endorsing them one way or the other, right? What I do think is it is insightful to see that the business leaders whom they help to convene, right, and other key decision makers are identifying these issues as high priority, right? But what I would say is you don't have to take the WEF's word for it. There are a lot of other sources out there, very reputable and important information on climate issues that is essential to be well informed and to make robust decisions. And in fact, I would argue against over reliance on any single source, right? I think that the reality of our climate and our lived environment and our society is evolving very quickly in ways that are difficult to fully understand, let alone predict the future. And so it's very important to be open minded and to not necessarily be hostile to, but to question the received wisdom, because it may not always have accounted for new and emerging aspects, or it might be dependent on outdated information that is no longer state of the art or fully suitable to answer all of these questions. And that's part of why it's so important to do the scenario analysis, which is fundamentally an exercise in suspending your assumptions about what the future is going to look like and say, what if we have certain circumstances that change, whether they're precipitated by an environmental crisis, whether it's from some other kind of development in the marketplace, adoption of new technology, new political climate. What if we find ourselves in those circumstances? Are we positioned to be resilient and to thrive? And, you know, you don't have to believe that those scenarios are absolutely going to happen to make that a very worthwhile exercise. Because otherwise, if you don't do that, it's a virtual guarantee that you're going to be caught flat footed when the world changes. And so the only way that we can be ready is to think through these possible futures and to really prepare ourselves as best we can and to see them coming. And if you've really done your homework and analyzed them, you can say, aha, these are some of the warning signs for a particular scenario that I studied actually coming to pass. And that is incredibly valuable information that can be fed back into investment decision making, into business strategy, and can really help to take advantage of those opportunities of the future, as well as to better manage risk. And so that's where I think you don't have to, think that the WEF is either always right or always wrong to take away the message that we are in a position where the world is changing quickly and it's changing in ways, some of which can be anticipated because of what we know about climate, but the interactions of and how different extreme events, which are somewhat random, occur and then have ripple effects. Understanding how those interplay and can create unexpected consequences is important. And so that's a big part of smart risk management and smart business strategy.
I think that's extremely well said. And the world is so complex these days. No one entity is going to know everything or not know everything. I think it's important to listen to all viewpoints and try to absorb as much as you can about it. And you really need, in today's world, specialists, because there's so much complexity out there. We need folks like yourself that are just focused on climate, and then we need other people that are focused on other areas to really be able to absorb how much complexity. And as you said, climate becomes a threat multiplier. So there's going to be other crises. We may have it's what I always find interesting is nobody's talking about another potential health crisis. And we just had a health crisis that sort of put the world on pause. And that could be a very real issue too. And then I think, of course, climate becomes a threat multiplier for that kind of a crisis. So it is very interesting. And, personally, I have nothing against the WEF, but I was listening to Rogan the other day and heard him bring it up, and he gets a lot more views than I do. So I figured I should talk about it.
No, it's a fair question, right? I don't think that we need to, accept certain pronouncements unquestioningly, right? I'm not sure exactly what he was arguing, but, I think it's fair to ask probing questions and to not take, these pronouncements as fact. At the same time, you need to do your homework, right? And not just be a skeptic, but, figure out what do you stand for, right? And what kind of action does your research tell you is warranted, right? And so I do think that there are a lot of facts out there, right? And this is not about the WEF one way or the other. This is simply an observation about the climate. Getting back to what I was saying at the beginning, the World Meteorological Organization, the WMO, has predicted that there's a very high probability of the world reaching 1.5 degrees Celsius warming, which is basically the Paris target for 2050. But the WMO sees that happening at least 1 year out of the next 5. And there's a very good chance that is going to be this year because we have the onset of an El Nino cycle, which often drives warming. We're already seeing record ocean warming around the world, and that brings a lot of extreme weather along with it. And this is uncharted territory, right? And most people are not ready for 1.5 degrees today. People think, oh, that's out in 2040, 2050. It's not. It's right around the corner, if not here right now. And so that really should give folks pause and say, what does a 1.5 degree world here and now mean for me, mean for my company? And are we ready for that? How do we get ready for that? And so I think that is really something to think seriously about.
And no, for sure. And I think it's hard for people because they hear 1.5 degrees and they think, oh, it won't be that bad. It's not that much worse if I go outside and it's only 1.5 degrees warmer. But there's tipping points. And then I can say, here, living here in South Florida, the sea level is rising faster than people forecast. I live in Jupiter, but there's a town nearby called Stewart. And up on the beach up there is a home that's basically falling into the ocean. And that's because of sea level rise. And that's even with significant mitigation efforts to increase the size of the beach and all that sort of stuff. It's kind of a lost cause. And it is happening faster than expected. A lot of people don't know that Miami Beach had to put in a $400 million pumping station to keep the water out. Now, on the mainland of Miami, not even on the barrier island, if it rains a little bit, you get flooding. When I got picked up in the Uber the other day, the guy had a Suburban. He said, don't worry, we've got floods. I got this car so I can go through it. There's cars that literally can't go through the afternoon thunder shower flooding that happens very quickly. And this is not even on the barrier island. So you can't deny that there's some sort of sea level rise going on. And I think for people, that's a tangible, visible, much like the wildfires or the floods in Vermont. It's more visceral than talking about, call it 1.5 degrees, because people can't make the connection to what that's going to mean and what it's going to manifest.
I'm glad you mentioned that because, I think that actually has been a huge failure of communication of the climate community, which now I myself have, participated in because 1.5 degrees doesn't really tell you the story, right? What you really need to know is what does 1.5 degrees mean in terms of lives and livelihoods, right? And it's the extremes. It is the onset of these chronic threats. It is the unprecedented extreme weather, things that used to only happen once in 2,000 years, once in 10,000 years. What you're doing is you're shifting the bell curve, right? And sometimes also the tails are getting higher, which means you get these extreme events that either were virtually impossible before in a world without climate change or were much rarer. And we now have to build our infrastructure, build our lives, build our societies around the expectation that these extreme events will happen or will even become our regular lived experience. And so that requires a real paradigm shift in a lot of cases. And we can't continue to operate as we have in the past.
Yep. Speaking of which, I've got thunder outside already. I don't know if
Yeah.
it came through on the microphone, but
No, I didn't hear something. I don't think, or maybe I'm just so used to my sirens here in New York, a little roll of thunder doesn't make much of a difference. But yeah, and also I wonder if you've been swimming off the beach lately because, Florida, I guess it's mostly down by the Keys, but, has had surface water temperatures of almost 100 degrees, right? With the recent heat wave. So these unprecedented ocean warming events are also very disruptive for fisheries, for coral reefs, for sea life of all kinds. And, it's a different world out there.
it is no doubt. I have concerns about the hurricane season, but we'll see. I mean, the storm last year that hit the west coast of Florida was terrible. It was definitely the worst storm I've ever seen hit the mainland of Florida. So we'll have to see what happens from here. But it's definitely not a good scenario when you hear about warming ocean temperatures because those are fuel for hurricanes.
Well, did you see? And a lot of insurers are pulling out, which is an even bigger crisis, right? So that as these disasters become more frequent and more damaging, and that interacts with housing crisis and with other factors that make rebuilding very difficult and expensive. And we're seeing insurers pull out of a lot of these markets that have extreme risk. You have a lot of insurers pulling out of California for wildfire insurance coverage of homeowners. You have flood insurance and homeowners insurance providers pulling out of Florida, and it's making it very expensive, often doubling or tripling insurance premiums, if insurance is even available at all, right? And so this is another kind of complex rolling crisis that we're seeing that has a lot of ripple effects in different markets.
Yeah, yeah, it's really interesting to think about. I remember when we got hit with a few storms in the early 2000s, Warren Buffett invested heavily in reinsurance companies and he did very well. I'm curious to see what's going to happen this time around. I think things may be more challenging now. We've progressed a lot further, but yeah, we'll just have to see what ultimately happens with that. But it certainly is reality that is happening. We saw an insurer pull out, I forget their name, but just a couple of weeks ago, make the announcement.
Farmers just pulled out
That's
last
right.
week, I believe. Yeah,
That's right.
of Florida,
So
out of Florida.
it's interesting. Well, Andrew, I mean, I could sit here and talk to you all day. We're getting at time, but can you tell the audience how to get in touch with you? How can they read your work and what's the best way for them to find you?
Sure. So they can certainly write to me directly at a.eil@tcs.com. That's my work email address at Tata Consultancy Services at TCS. They can also look for my byline, or they can follow me on LinkedIn or Twitter where I post my work. But as you mentioned, I'm a regular contributor to The Observer and to Illuminum. And so if you put in my name or go to those websites or put them together, you should be able to find me. And feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn, where I'm a regular active poster.
No, very good. Appreciate that, Andrew. This has been Energy Superheroes with Andrew Isle. And Andrew's the head of climate risk for TCS North America. He also advises startups on climate risk and venture capital. Andrew, thanks for being on today.
It was great, Peter. Thank you so much for having me.